Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of The Scope here on British Muslim TV with me, your host, Waqar Rizvi. We are coming to you today on the anniversary, the 21st anniversary, that is, of the 9/11 attacks in the United States. Now, as I said, it has been 21 years since those attacks took place. Since then, the US, as well as its global allies, have waged a self-named war on terror in order to defeat global terrorism. Now, in the process, much of the global media, politicians, as well as pundits have made arguably a scapegoat of Muslims worldwide to support both their policies abroad in wars and at home in surveilling and in some cases even openly persecuting Muslim communities. A new book has been released this month entitled The Rise of Global Islamophobia in the War on Terror and has been co-edited by our panelist who is joining us for this special edition. This book sheds light on the various forms of post-9/11 Islamophobia, with each chapter written by an expert covering a different country and region. Well, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Naved Bakali, who is an author as well as assistant professor of anti-racism education at the Faculty of Education at the University of Windsor. Naved, assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much for joining us today for this special edition of The Scope. I'm going to get right into it, Naved, and of course, I saw that you've written a chapter on the Rohingya and their persecution, and it's been now 5 years since the Rohingya had to flee Myanmar. So I wanted to start off on that point, if I may, with you. How do you reflect on these 5 years? How do you reflect on why this even occurred and obviously the Islamophobia behind it?
Yeah, so I think that one thing that really comes to mind when we talk about the Rohingya, I actually had the opportunity to go to the camps, and when I went to the camps, I began to realize that what happened with the Rohingya is very much similar. There's patterns that you kind of see in the case of Myanmar and other spaces across the global north and global south. And that's kind of what got my mind running about, how Islamophobia has really become a global sort of phenomenon, stretching beyond the global north, but also in the global south. And so ultimately what I argue in that chapter and what I really kind of feel has happened is that through this sort of war on terror logic and rhetoric that's being employed by politicians and within the public space, pretty much everything and anything can be justified in the name of national security. Even ethnic cleansing, which is what we see in China with the Uyghurs, and even genocide, which is what we saw with the Rohingya in Myanmar.
I'm glad you brought up China because, in fact, the outgoing now UN Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, and as you know, there's been huge controversy about the fact that the Xinjiang part of the Human Rights Report has not yet been released. It may very well be released as of this conversation being aired, but nevertheless, Michelle Bachelet has made it very clear that she is under a tremendous amount of pressure by the Chinese not to even release that report. So, I mean, we obviously just know what we know, right, about what's happened in Xinjiang. But do you think that the reality may be a lot worse, and that is what the Chinese are hiding? And of course, in your thoughts on the Chinese Islamophobia in this case?
I mean, definitely, I think what we know from public reporting is it's only a fraction of what's actually happening there. I mean, there's been some documented reports from people that have fled and that have escaped, which really very much documents ethnic cleansing, and these are according to the conventions that China itself has sort of signed on to. Forced sterilization, this idea of re-education, which is pretty much trying to ensure that people within the Uyghur population essentially kind of denounces their faith altogether. So there's extreme sort of policing that's happening within these detention camps. And I think when you look at the case of the Uyghurs, and again, this ties into this idea of how the war on terror really kind of changed the discourse. I mean, the Uyghurs for decades now have been seen as sort of a sort of cultural threat, a threat to the cohesiveness of the Chinese state. And so this has been the case for a number of years. But in 9/11, in the context of the war on terror, now the state is able to use the sort of premise that the Uyghurs are a terrorist threat more and more. And so in the name of national security, in the name of, of protecting the nation from this terrorist threat, they've kind of doubled down and justified essentially creating internment camps for the Uyghurs and closing them in within these camps. And there's roughly around 1 million of them in these camps. So I think the most atrocious things have been justified in the name of national security, and the war on terror has created a context for that to happen.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about here at this juncture is that, whenever we talk about the war on terror and the Islamophobia that may be associated with it, we tend to, many times speak just about the Western countries, right? So obviously the Russians and Chinese do not come into that axis, but why is it, do you think, that even they would almost take advantage in some ways of the fact that the Western countries wage this war on terror globally? And, we can probably talk about the Tatars in Russia and the way they've treated them in the Crimean region, et cetera, as well. And of course, the Uyghurs in China, because to many people on the other side, on, the anti-imperial, if I may use that term, side, this is sort of baffling, right? Why would they also be having these sort of Islamophobic policies?
Yeah, so I think that, when we look at Islamophobia, the term itself kind of came out of academic discourse as well, right? I mean, this term and the ideas around it really kind of fled or came out of academic work. And most of this was coming out of Western context, right? And so a lot of it draws from these ideas of recite and this idea of Orientalism, this sort of Western gaze on the Orient or the Muslim world. And so from that sort of legacy, I think a lot of academics over the years that have written about Islamophobia have focused on Western context. And so I think that for that reason, a lot of people, when they think of Islamophobia, they really kind of limit it and think of it specifically as a phenomenon within the global north. But depending on, and again, the term Islamophobia, how it's defined, it can be defined in many different ways. But more and more, I think what's happening now is that a lot of these sort of I would say sort of localized conflicts that are very much tied to ethnicity and local geopolitical histories and realities, they're becoming infused more and more and conflated with the war on terror. And so ultimately, even though a lot of what we saw, or the case of Chechnya, or the case of Xinjiang, or even what we saw in Myanmar, in what we saw in India, a lot of these were traditional or long-standing sort of ethnic, cultural, geopolitical sort of conflicts that were not tied in any way to security or securitization. But I think what's happened is because we live in a very sort of interconnected world, and with the communication technologies that we have now, everything is public and everything is known. And so to sanitize what's happening in these places, to justify the aggression and the sort of the injustices that are happening within these spaces, there needs to be a rhetoric and a logic that's employed, and that very much ties to, I think, the what I call the war on terror logic, where you can essentially justify everything and anything in the name of national security.
Indeed. And let's, in fact, talk about that justification, right? Because since 9/11, and I'll throw this out there as well as an interesting fact, that we now have George W. Bush teaching a masterclass in leadership, right? And I wonder what your thoughts are on that and how you reacted to that reality too. Because for all of us, especially who were not even journalists necessarily when 9/11 happened, but became journalists fairly soon after, it's sort of baffling, this sort of, I don't know if it's a rewrite of history in some ways, right? Where we're forgetting his role in all of this, and we're sort of, rewriting history altogether to make him a pacifist in some ways. What are your thoughts on George W. Bush, as well as you said, the justification for these, continuing justification, in fact, is not ended yet, justification for wars using then Islamophobia?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think with George Bush, he had a recent slip of the tongue where he kind of talked about the destruction of Iraq unintentionally. And I think ultimately what happens is that, a lot of these atrocities happen and countless lives are lost in the process. But I think that the general public discourse kind of doesn't really pay much attention to this. It's because again, we're coming from a more think, Western-centric space. But if you're going to look at media and conversations outside of the West, when, specifically in Asia and other spaces, I think there's a lot more of a critical sort of stance on what has happened. We tend to have a sort of amnesia and a whitewashing and a convenient sort of forgetfulness when it comes to genocide and mass atrocities that Western states have created and have engaged with. I mean, if you look at, for example, Canada, the country that I live in, we're celebrated as this multicultural state and nation. And I think the world kind of sees us as that. But people tend to forget that we have a long history of genocide within our own country. The indigenous populations have been decimated and their lives have been taken in this country. But that tends to be forgotten because of this sort of national discourse on tolerance and multiculturalism and so on. And so I think there tends to be this sort of whitewashing of history when it comes to these instances because they don't, they're not, who are the victims in the process, right? I mean, if it's indigenous folks, if it's brown-skinned Asians, there tends to be, an amnesia that takes place. Whereas, when it's atrocities happening to white Europeans, it's a different story altogether. So I think that it really depends on who the victims are, and that kind of helps us explain and understand, why is it that how do we see things in retrospect?
Well, we're just about to go into a break, Naved, so I'm going to just ask you to stand by with us, of course, as we come back from that break. And of course, viewers, you can see the numbers, in fact, on the side of your screen there at the bottom. We, of course, would appreciate any comments, et cetera, that you may have about this show as well. And of course, send in any comments you may have, even for Naved, and we will send those on to him if you so wish. We're talking, of course, with Naved about the book, The Rise of Global Islamophobia in the War on Terror, which he has co-edited as well as written a chapter for. And after we come back from the break, I'm going to talk more about, in fact, Canada, as Naved there mentioned, as well as the Western countries, Europe as well, in fact, as well as overall, what then happens now going forward, where we now have as well a rise of right-wing terrorism, which is also interesting to see how that then, the comparison between what we would call quote unquote Islamist terrorism in some terminology versus right-wing terrorism, and that sort of comparison in the way that they're being reacted to in different ways is being handled by different countries around the world within this global war on terror. I'll be back right after this break. Please do stay tuned to Naved and I. Welcome back, everyone, to this special edition of The Scope here on BMTV today with me, your host, Waqar Rizvi, as we continue to discuss and reflect on the 21st anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And we're discussing that new book that I introduced, of course, before the break and in my introduction earlier on as well. And one of the co-editors, as well as one of the authors of a chapter in that book, Naved Bakali, is still with us. Naved, before going to the break, you mentioned, and of course you are sitting in Windsor, Ontario in Canada, and the Canadian context is an interesting one, right? Because I've also grown up in Canada and a Canadian, and as you said, it's always sold as this multicultural country, and that's not to say that it's not, but at the same time, the issues that exist there many times, especially beyond Canadian borders, many people do not completely fully understand as far as Islamophobia or even other forms of xenophobia may go. So I'll just take the example of Quebec, for example, right? And we have a bill there, for example, which limits the use of religious symbols in certain places and for certain roles. I wonder what your thoughts are on the logic of that. And I don't want to just pick on Quebec as a province, of course, because we now have Islamophobic incidents in Ontario too, increasingly. But I just wonder what your thoughts are about that, and how does that fit into this entire logic of, the other, the Muslim, essentially?
Yes, it relates to kind of what I was saying earlier about this idea of systemic forms of racism and then sort of the interpersonal forms of racism. And I think what's happening here, and that law, the specific law that you're referring to, is a form of systemic racism, which really does target Muslims. Ultimately, what this is, the purpose of this legislation is really to consolidate a political base of the party that's in power in Quebec. They know that they have a base of supporters which are older, white, francophone people, and they one of their concerns is the changing demographics of Canada. And Canada, I think, is, like we said earlier, it's a very multicultural nation. It relies a lot on immigrant populations to come and sustain the natural growth, or sustain the population growth of the country. And so what happens is that Muslims often get targeted because they're a very visible minority within Quebec. I mean, the Muslims in general are coming from Asian countries or African countries, so they're darker skinned than the majority. A lot of Muslim women wear the head cover, and some wear the face cover as well. And so to target that community, which is very sort of visible, it's an easy way to gain political points with a base which has fears around this idea of the preservation of their culture, their heritage, and their sort of position within Canadian society and Quebec society. So I think they tend to be kind of an easy and convenient target, specifically in Quebec. And I think that's partially why that law was passed. But I mean, there's other reasons as well, which again relate to the broader sort of discourse of Muslims being a threat and so on. And so to police them and to limit their expression in the public sphere is a part of that.
A much more extreme example than of Quebec would be if we're going all the way across the seas to France then, right? And we've had even Emmanuel Macron, come out quite strongly against what he has termed Islamism or Islamo-leftism, I believe maybe the term in English, the correct translation of the French term. But I wonder where your thoughts are on the French, right? Because Muslims in France are the largest such minority, largest Muslim minority, I should say, in Europe, in that country. So it's not like Muslims are new there. They're well established there as well. They have been there in some cases for generations. What are your thoughts on why they're being targeted now in that country?
So I think in the case with France, and I think a lot of European states, one thing that we found interesting, and this came up in the book, and I think the chapters that deal with Europe, is that the European context is very much tied to sort of a colonial, I think, discourse on Muslims. So a lot of all of the countries that we talked about in the book that touch on the European context, they're all nations that had a history of colonizing Muslim majority countries. The Netherlands, the UK, and France, they're all countries that have sort of a historic legacy of colonizing Muslim nations. And so one thing that's interesting is that the sort of colonial legacy within those states is reflected again in the present context. And so the discourse around Muslims when France was colonizing Muslim majority lands was very much this idea of stamping out any signs of the religion, any signs of the culture. And the belief was that if they were able to do that, they can sort of eliminate this sort of resistance to the French culture and the French sort of power within that state. And so very much you see that reflecting again now in the specific case of France. France is a very sort of extreme example within Europe. I think it's one of the more outspoken nations in Europe, which really targets Muslims. Another thing with France specifically is that it promotes this idea of secularism, which is, I think, unique to France, right? They call it laïcité. And you see this in Quebec as well. And this kind of gives you an idea of why the laws in Quebec are as extreme as they are. But this idea of laïcité in France, it's very much tied to this idea of eliminating altogether religion within the public sphere. Whereas in other places, secularism is kind of understood as not, to not impose a religious dogma in the public sphere. Whereas in France, it's the elimination of any traces of religion within the public sphere. In other words, you cannot sort of have religion coexist with the public sphere in any way. And so there's been a lot of sort of legislations being passed in France which limit that, which eliminate that in any way. And what's happening in France now is that, it's not just the right that's targeting Muslims. It's not just the right-wing politicians like Marine Le Pen. You have centrists and people that, term themselves on the left as well, which are, very much targeting Muslims under the sort of premise of them being a threat to the secular state.
One other thing when it comes to Europe, which is interesting, and I'm sure you've seen and heard of these debates, is that when the Russian invasion of Ukraine begun and Ukrainians started fleeing, there were a lot of even anchors on media who said things like, these are not the normal quote unquote refugees that are showing up on Europe's shores. They look like you and I. obviously paraphrasing what they were saying to their respective audiences. And, and a lot of people obviously got criticized for that. Some even lost their jobs and or were suspended from their work because of saying and making such statements. But I wonder what your thoughts are on that whole issue of migrant invasion, if I may borrow a term that Priti Patel of the UK used, right? Describing these migrants, and I'm speaking right now about Syrian/Afghan/even African refugees and asylum seekers who have shown up on Europe's shores over the years. What do you make of that difference of reaction?
I mean, I think that when we look at this idea of migration in general, when you have outsiders coming in within, not just in the global north, but in other spaces as well. But let's look at Western nation states as an example. There tends to be this sort of threshold of tolerance that people are willing to accept. And so when it comes to people that migrate for, people that are skilled labor, people that have that are educated, that can, that produce, fruitful, what's deemed as or what's considered sort of useful work within the state. There's sort of this tolerance of those groups, and so there's a limited sort of acceptance that these people can come because they're bringing something to us, but that sort of tolerance has a threshold, and so when it's these sort of migrants that are coming because of forced migration, people that are refugees. When it comes to specifically Muslims, there's a threshold, and that threshold is okay. It gets exceeded. It gets passed. People sort of break that threshold. There's less tolerance for these groups that might not have as much to offer. Whereas if you look at I think European migrants, there's more of a sort of the sense of camaraderie or this idea that these are our people. We need to help them. We need to bring them in. And so there's probably more of a level of tolerance beyond just people that are coming for work, but people that are forced migrants as well. So I think it relates very much to this idea of tolerance. And again, just when we look at the linguistics of multicultural nations, they pride themselves in this idea of tolerance, right? Tolerance is promoted as this positive thing. But ultimately, what underscores this idea of tolerance is that there's not really an acceptance of these different groups. There's more kind of just this willingness to tolerate them as opposed to accept them. So I think there's a threshold that gets exceeded when you have these sort of forced migrants coming into these states.
Yeah. Another thing I want to talk about with you is right-wing extremism that we see rising pretty much across the world, right? And this will be my final question to you, Naved. Right-wing extremism, we can talk about the case, of course, of India, even Israel possibly, and certainly in many of the Western countries as well around the world, and the reactions to them, right? So war on terror, technically, one would think would cover all of the above. I mean, do you think it does?
Well, for sure, this idea of far-right extremism is growing, I think, all over Western states, but even in the global South as well. And so when you look at Myanmar, India, these are far-right extremist actors that are engaging in ethnic cleansing and genocide. There is a growth of this for sure. And I think what happens is that, I mean, the growth of far-right extremism really very much is tied to this idea of nativism. And when you promote this idea of nativism, and then you kind of have this sense of this idea that certain groups are threatening your national cohesion or your in-group, your ethnic in-group, and so on. When you have this sort of promotion of these ideas that certain groups are threatening that unity, that cohesion, they become easy targets. And in Western states specifically, Muslims become a very easy target because like I said earlier, a lot of Muslims are coming from Africa, from Asia, so their skin color is different. Muslim women tend to be a bit more visible if they wear the hijab or the niqab. But then you also have the growth of this nativism within places like within Burma or Myanmar rather, and India, right? And I think that this is all kind of just sort of a political maneuvering that's happening, where people are seizing on the political points they can gain by scapegoating these minorities that have been a part of these societies for generations and that are indigenous to these spaces. By creating this division, it gains easy political points, and it ultimately allows for these people to stay in power, to retain power, and to gain more power.
Very well, Naved. We'll leave it there at that, but we of course appreciate you taking your time out of a busy schedule to speak to us here in the scope here on BMTV. And of course, I encourage all viewers to try to find that book if they can, The Rise of the Global Islamophobia and the War on Terror, and to definitely read it. I will definitely be looking for a signed copy, Naved, at some point in time, inshallah. But we appreciate your time. As I said, that was Naved Bakali, author as well as assistant professor of anti-racism education at the Faculty of Education at the University of Windsor, who was speaking to us there. We spoke a lot about, of course, a post 9/11 world, the war on terror. We got to quite a few specific countries as well. And of course, we always want to know what your thoughts are on these shows. So please send us your comments at the numbers at the bottom of your screen as well. And of course, do stay tuned for Scope episodes every Tuesday. Thank you for watching.